Mia never liked funerals, but she had to go. It was her mother's old friend who had passed away, someone Mia had only met once or twice. She didn't know him well, but she went out of respect. The funeral was like any other. People cried, whispered prayers, and stood in silence as the casket was lowered into the ground. Mia felt uneasy the whole time. Maybe it was just the graveyard. Who wouldn't feel strange surrounded by sadness? But that night, something felt different. She dreamed of the casket. It was just there in her mind, heavy and still. She wasn't inside it, and no one opened it. Just lay there in the dark. She woke up sweating. At first she ignored it. Just a dream. Nothing more. Until it happened again and again, and every single night. No matter how tired she was, no matter how late she stayed up, the moment she fell asleep, the casket was waiting. It never moved. Never changed. Just sat in the darkness. By the end of the week, she was scared to sleep. Her eyes were sunken, her body felt heavy, and exhaustion clung to her like a weight she couldn't shake. Her mother noticed. "What's wrong? You look like you haven't slept in days." Mia hesitated. She didn't want to sound crazy, but she couldn't keep it in. So she told her. Her mother listened without a word. Then she called Mia's father into the room. They exchanged a look, one that sent a chill through Mia. "We need to purify the house," her mother said. Mia blinked. "What?" That evening, they lit incense, whispered prayers, and sprinkled water in every corner of the house. Mia just watched, too tired to ask why. For the first time in a week, she slept peacefully. The next morning, she felt lighter, as if something had been lifted from her. Her mother only said one thing. "It followed you home." Mia never asked how she knew. Moving into a house near a graveyard wasn't my first choice, but the rent was cheap and I had no other options. The place was old but livable. Through my window I could see the cemetery, not too close, not too far, just there. I ignored it. The first night was quiet. The second night wasn't. A soft but deliberate knock woke me up. I sat up, heart pounding, and checked the time, 2:47 a.m. I waited, but nothing else happened. Maybe I imagined it. The third night it happened again. I crept toward the door, my fingers hovering over the knob. "Who's there?" Silence. Holding my breath, I swung the door open. No one. A cold breeze swept past me, carrying the scent of damp earth. I slammed the door shut. The knocking continued for the next few nights, always at the same time, getting louder and more insistent. Then one night, someone knocked on the door so hard, the door shook in its frame like someone was trying to break in. My heart hammered as a dry, hollow voice rasped from the other side said, "Open the door." I came home. I froze. My blood ran cold. Then again knocked on the door violently. The whole house trembled. The air felt thick and heavy. He said again, "I came home. Open the door." I squeezed my eyes shut, too terrified to move. Then suddenly it stopped. Silence filled the house. I stayed awake until sunrise. The next morning, I asked a neighbor about the house. They said, "That place?" "Yeah, the owner of the house died last year." My throat tightened. Then after a pause they said, "He was buried in the cemetery right outside your window." My stomach dropped. I couldn't breathe. I knew what had been knocking. I didn't ask any more questions. I went home, packed my bags, and by sundown, I was gone. It happened 3 years ago. My grandmother had passed, and one evening, I went to visit her grave. The cemetery was quiet, just the sound of leaves rustling and the distant hum of cars outside the gates. I sat by her headstone like always, talking to her about life, telling her how much I missed her. The sky was cloudy, and the air smelled like damp earth. I didn't even realize how late it had gotten. Then I heard it, a whisper. Soft, raspy, coming from behind me. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. I was sure I was alone when I got there. Slowly I turned my head. Nothing. just rows of graves disappearing into the fog. I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was the wind, or maybe I was just tired. I took a deep breath, trying to shake the feeling. Then I heard it again, closer. A dry voice whispering my name. My heart started pounding as I jumped to my feet. "Hello?" My voice sounded shaky. Silence. Then I heard footsteps, slow, careful, coming from the trees at the edge of the cemetery. I gripped my phone, my thumb hovering over the call button. Maybe it was just another visitor or a caretaker doing their rounds, but something about it didn't feel right. I turned toward the gate, ready to leave. That's when I saw it. A figure stood near my grandmother's grave. Not a shadow, not a trick of the light. Someone was there. They were tall and thin, standing kind of hunched over. I couldn't make out their face in the dim light, but I knew they were looking right at me. I took a slow step back, my instincts screaming at me to go. Then the figure raised one hand and waved. That was it. I turned and walked as fast as I could without running. By the time I reached my car, my hands were shaking so badly I struggled to get the keys in the ignition. As I pulled away, I glanced back at my grandmother's grave. The figure was gone. I still don't know if it was just another visitor, a caretaker, or something else. But the way they stood, the way they moved, it left me feeling uneasy. A few years ago, I worked as a night watchman at a cemetery. It wasn't a bad job, mostly just walking around, making sure no one was trespassing and calling it in if anything seemed off. Pretty quiet most nights. One night, though, something happened that I still can't explain. It was a Friday around 2 a.m. and the fog was thick. I was doing my final walk of the night when I noticed something strange. One of the graves was open. Not just disturbed, but completely dug up. I stopped and just stared at it for a second. This wasn't a fresh grave. The headstone showed the person had been buried for over 50 years. The ground should have been packed solid, so there was no reason it should look like that. I stepped closer and shined my flashlight into the hole. It was empty. Before I could even process what I was looking at, I heard something behind me. A rustling sound. Then slow, shuffling footsteps. I turned fast, sweeping my light through the fog, but at first I didn't see anything. Then, from behind a headstone, a man stepped out. He was thin, wearing old, tattered clothes. His face was pale, almost sickly, and his eyes looked strange, dark and unfocused. I remember thinking he might be homeless or maybe high on something. I asked if he was okay, but he didn't respond. He just twitched a little, and that's when I noticed something was wrong with his foot. It was turned at a really weird angle. That was enough for me. I wasn't about to deal with a possibly unstable guy alone in a cemetery at 2 a.m. I turned and walked fast back to the guardhouse, locked the door, and called the cops. As I was on the phone, I heard knocking on the window. Slow, heavy knocks. I turned my head, and there he was, standing right outside. His face was pressed against the glass, and his breath was fogging it up. His mouth was slightly open, like he was trying to say something but couldn't. He knocked again. Same slow, heavy thud. At that point, I was done. I backed away and waited for the cops to arrive. When they finally showed up, the guy was gone. They searched the area but didn't find anyone. Even the grave I had seen open was back to normal. No sign it had ever been disturbed. They probably thought I was seeing things. Maybe I was, but I know what I saw. And to this day, I have no explanation for it.